Good morning, everyone. This is Karina Bohl. I'm Senior Policy Advisor at the City of Seattle Office of Labor Standards, and I am so glad that folks have joined us this morning for our journey through secure scheduling. We're going to be together for about an hour and a half, and during that time period, I'll be going over the basics of our new secure scheduling ordinance that just went into effect a few days ago on July 1st. If you have questions, feel free to go ahead and type them on the sidebar, and I'll get to them after I go over the preliminary information. And then for those of you who are participating by phone, feel free to go ahead and just turn on your mic and say your question. We have just about 30 participants today, so I think that it'll be okay for folks to let their questions percolate as we're going along. The basic presentation will take about an hour, and then at the end, we'll have about 30 to 45 minutes for additional questions. And as a reminder to everyone, the sound is amplified and we can hear the clicking and the clacking of your efficient multitasking if you're doing something else. So in the fire engines and all of that. So if you could please turn off your mic, we appreciate it. So to begin, I work at the City of Seattle Office of Labor Standards. We are an agency within the City of Seattle, and we administer this new law. We do a number of things, all to advance workplace equity. And in achieving those goals, we are supporting business as well as workers with an underlying commitment to race and social justice. So we really want folks to know that as we implement all of our 6 labor standards, you see them here before you: minimum wage, wage theft, paid sick and safe time, fair chance employment, that's our ban the box law, our hotel employees health and safety initiative, and of course secure scheduling. We are working tremendously hard to make sure that we focus on business and support you as you put these laws into place, because of course we know they're not going to be successful if you don't have the right tools and information. So what you see before you is our email address for business questions and the folks who are answering them. So we have 2 full-time business liaisons, Darius and Karam. There's also myself. I'm handling questions for secure scheduling and the Hotel Employees Health and Safety Initiative. Please know that you are welcome to call us, to email us. We strive to answer questions within 2 business days. Sometimes it can take a week depending on the volume or the complexity. Something you can always count on is that this is private technical assistance and that we are not sharing any of the information with our enforcement side. So there is a 3-mile wide firewall between these different parts of our office, and we want everyone to feel very secure in asking us questions. We don't offer legal advice, but we are able to explain how the law works, and we also can comment on your specific scenario. So here you see myself and Darius and Karam, and here's the rest of our staff. We work really hard and we are committed to our mission, and we eat lunch and we celebrate birthdays. So we are a hardworking and merry crew. If you have additional questions about secure scheduling and perhaps you're not able to contact one of our business liaisons or myself, we do have quite an extensive list of growing resources online. So just want to make sure that everyone is comfortable and familiar with our website. We've got our presentations on there, our poster, and other documents that are ongoing. Recently, we sent out a postcard mailer to every business that we estimate is covered by the law. So perhaps you've seen this postcard in your mail. We estimate that about 1,100 businesses are covered by this law, and we soon will publish that list and get feedback on whether or not we need to add more folks to it as well. In addition to this webinar, we've got some other ones coming up. So feel free to attend more as your schedule allows, and if there are certain topics that you'd like to see, please do let us know. So now we begin on the meaty part of this ordinance. Why does it exist? The reason and the policy goals for this law are to enable employees to have predictable schedules that work. Simply put, it's schedules that allow folks to balance their work and life commitments, whether that be establishing a budget and being able to stick with that budget, knowing whether or not there needs to be a second job in order to meet those financial needs, If someone wants to enroll in a class, knowing that they can commit to going to a class at a particular reoccurring time every week. If there are juggling needs for childcare or family care, a predictable schedule will allow all of that to happen. And if sometimes that schedule needs to change, then there's extra compensation, and we'll talk more about that later. So to begin, this law covers hourly employees at fixed point of sale locations for large food services and retail establishments. For the employees, it is all overtime eligible employees. That includes hourly managers as well. There is a carve-out for employees who might work at the fixed point of sale location, but who are fulfilling more of a corporate role, behind the scenes corporate role. So examples of those kinds of employees that would not be covered include something like someone working in a human resources capacity, a receptionist capacity, marketing, administrative support. Otherwise, all hourly employees that are in the footprint of that fixed point of sale location will be covered. So that definitely includes those who are working in the front of the house and in the back of the house. For a restaurant, that would mean that the host and the server and the bussers, all of those folks would be covered, the bartenders, as well as the cooks and the sous chef and the dishwasher. For a retail establishment, it would be the clerks and the cashiers and the folks stocking the shelves in the front of the house and in the back of the house. If there is a warehouse that is attached to the retail establishment and is still in the same footprint, then those folks working in the warehouse as well would be covered. And again, feel free to let your questions percolate. You're welcome to ask verbally. It might be easier if you're able to use the written sidebar, but if that's not possible, verbal is fine as well. Now, as far as the types of businesses that are covered, large food service and retail employers, this is defined by NAICS codes. And a NAICS code is the North American Industry Classification System. It is set by the federal government, and there are certain numbers assigned to certain types of businesses. So there is a certain number assigned for retail and for food service. The ordinance defines what NAICS code applies for this particular law. And for retail, it's going to be numbers that fall within the range of 441 through 453,998. The reason why that number becomes so precise at the end is because the retail establishments, that umbrella does not include electronic commerce, so it had to stop at a very precise number. Food service includes the full range of food services establishments, from mobile trucks to coffee shops, limited service, catering, and full service restaurants. However, for full service restaurants, there is an additional requirement for 40 plus full service restaurant locations worldwide. And for all of these employers, there also is a threshold requirement for having 500 employees worldwide. For franchises, just like with the minimum wage ordinance, those franchises will count their local employees and all of the employees in the worldwide franchise network. So if there is a local franchise sandwich shop that has 5 employees, but the worldwide franchise network has hundreds of thousands, then that business will be covered. So in a nutshell, employer coverage depends on whether it is a retail or food service establishment as defined by the NAICS code, whether or not there are 500 plus employees worldwide, and for full service restaurants, an additional requirement for 40 plus full service restaurant locations worldwide. This is a rather narrow category of businesses that are initially covered. Just to let you all know, the policy reason for that is that research shows that scheduling problems can happen in any kind of business, but research also showed that there was a higher concentration among larger businesses, particularly those that had the ability to have just-in-time scheduling software. So for this run of the ordinance, it is focusing on the larger businesses that also may have the human resources capacity to be able to implement these new requirements. Now, there is a secure scheduling study that is evaluating the impacts of this new law on both workers and businesses. And it is measuring the baseline, which is right now, or what was right now before the law went into effect, and then after the first year of implementation and after the second year of implementation. Based on a review of the reports from this study that is being conducted by independent academic researchers, it's funded by the city, but it's being conducted independent of the city. Then City Council and Mayor Executive Staff will review the reports, and the ordinance could be opened up again, perhaps some substantive revisions, and perhaps the employers who are covered could expand or contract. If you would like more information about that study, I'm happy to provide it offline as well. So here's more information about the NAICS code. You can see how there's a wide variety of different businesses that are covered. This is just a snapshot. It is much more extensive than this. If you're wondering how to find your NAICS code, you can go into the City of Seattle Business License Database. It's super easy to use. There's a highlighted website on this slide. Type in the name of the business, and then there'll be a listing that comes up that gives the basic information about the business, including the NAICS code. And you can see the red arrow there is pointing to what the NAICS code is for this particular business. So we've gone over which employees are covered and which employers are covered, and now we are moving on to the 6 main requirements. Again, feel free to add your questions. It might make it a little bit more lively. We are beginning with the good faith estimate of work schedule. This is information that an employer provides to all new hires as of July 1. For existing employees, employers have 90 days from July 1 to provide this information. So moving forward, all your new hires will get this information. Your existing employees, you'll have until the end of September to get them this information. The good faith estimate is simply providing new employees with an expectation of what will happen during their employment with your business. And so this will accompany the notice of employment information that is already required by our wage theft law. The wage theft law requires basics about their employment, the employer name, their rate of pay, scheduled payday. This good faith estimate is just adding on a new section. And this new section is providing a written estimate of median hours and on-call shifts. And when providing the median number of hours, it's not the average, it's the median, so it'll be a single number, not a range. The benefit of having a median is that that range is already built into it. And so the median incorporates the fluctuations that might happen per work week. And the good faith estimate is going to be provided in 3-month increments. That allows employers to indicate when the median number of hours per work week might change due to seasonal fluctuations. Here's an example you see here. It could be something that looks like this, where it's divided into different quarters. It doesn't have to be a quarter that begins January 1. It can be the quarter that begins when they're hired. This is up to the employer to determine how they want to break down their 3-month increments. If there are no seasonal fluctuations, the employer could just say something along the lines of, for every quarter of the year, it's going to be 20 hours. And you can see here there's also an indication of whether the employee is working on-call shifts. As far as the format that this good faith estimate needs to be in, that's up for the employer to decide. It can be in an offer letter, it can be in an email, it can be in a memo, or it could be using our template that we have available on our website. The template that's on our website is our notice of employment information with a new section at the bottom, which is just about the good faith estimate. We have a Word version of it that you are welcome to modify. We also have a fillable PDF, which is very easy to fill. Again, you don't need to use this good faith estimate template, but we offer it to you as a means for doing it that might be easier for your business. As with the number of the documents that are required by this law, there is a translation requirement that the good faith estimate be provided in English and in the primary language of the employee. Now, also with all of these translation requirements, it is our office's responsibility to provide those translation templates. So we currently have this GFE, as we call it, in English. We are working on the translations, and please join our newsletter list to get up-to-date information of when those translations are available. You also can regularly check our website, which is where we will post them, and employers are not required to provide those translations until we do our job of getting you the templates. So that translation process is already underway. We work very hard to provide accurate translations, so sometimes it does take a while. We have it translated by a professional service and then vetted by a fluent community member. So we really want these translations to be accurate in the word choices that they're using, and that takes time. Now, if over the course of the year an employee notices that there is a difference in the written schedule that they are receiving and their good faith estimate, they do have the legal right to check in with the employer every 3 months and have a conversation about that. The good faith estimate doesn't create a contract between the employer and the employee. It does not create a guaranteed minimum number of hours, but it does set the course for what the employee can expect. And if it is off course, then the employer is just required to have a conversation. The ordinance calls it a interactive process about that perceived significant change. And then the employer will revise the good faith estimate if that is necessary. Are there any questions about the good faith estimate? While we're waiting, I'll also add that for current employees, the good faith estimate can be provided separate from all of the other notice of employment information. For new employees, all of that notice of employment information, including the good faith estimate, does need to be in a singular location, which again can be an offer letter or a template or some other format. Next is the right to request. This section is permitting employees to have a voice in their schedule preferences. And it allows employees to have the legally protected ability to request schedule preferences prior to when the employer posts the work schedule. So what this means in practice is that the employee has a legally protected right to voice their preferences for time and location of work prior to when the employer has the customary cutoff point for those kind of schedule requests. So most employers that we talk with have a schedule that lasts about a week. And so at any given time with the advance notice requirement of 14 days, there'll be about 3 weeks of schedules posted in the place of business. Employers might need to have all of the schedule requests in 3 weeks before the next schedule is posted. So employees have the right to get in these particular schedule preferences up until your decision point of when they need to get in. And that might be 3 weeks, it might be 4 weeks. It just does need to be reasonable. So they can request specific times and locations of work. The employer is required to have a conversation with them about that and to complete that conversation within 3 weeks. The ordinance calls this the interactive process. It's just a back and forth dialogue between the manager and the employee, the owner and the employee. That dialogue can happen over text, over email, face-to-face, over phone. There's a lot of discretion in different ways for this to happen. Now, if the request for the schedule change is due to any reason other than a major life event, the employer is free to say yes or no and to leave it at that. So if an employee is typically scheduled for Tuesdays and Thursdays and suddenly doesn't want to work on Thursdays because they are interested in going on a reoccurring trip or something personal or social of that nature, the employer is free to say yes or no. However, if the employee says, well, I usually work on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings, but now I would like to work in the evenings because I'm taking a class, that class is actually an example of a major life event that would require extra obligations on the employer. The employer would need to say yes unless there's a bona fide business reason for saying no. So here is the full list of major life events that are going to add some increased obligations for meeting the schedule request of the employee. Changes in employees' transportation, that could be they no longer have a car and so they're taking the bus, and so their work schedule needs to somewhat match up to the bus schedule. Or maybe the bus schedule changed, and so that's going to have an impact on when they're able to get to work. It could be changes in employees' housing, the employee's own serious health condition. In those situations, there might be some overlap with family medical leave or with reasonable accommodations for a disability or with paid sick and safe time. The employee's responsibilities as a caregiver, that could be for a family member with a serious health condition. It could also be taking care of kids, and that could be as simple as the daycare situation didn't work out, or the babysitter wasn't able to work that day. Maybe she or he called in sick. It could be a parent-teacher conference. So obviously there's a wide range of caregiving responsibilities, abilities when taking care of a family member, whether a minor or an adult. Could be the employee's enrollment in a career-related educational or training program. So that's taking the class in college or GRE, other situations. And then last, it can be the employee's other job or jobs. So if you're able to meet the request, you don't need to necessarily ask whether or not it's related to a major life event. You can simply say yes, mark it on the schedule, and that is your written grant of the request. And just a side note about requirements for things to be written in the law, that can always happen in a physical format or with electronic. So the law does recognize that writing happens in many different ways in this technologically advanced time. However, if you're not able to meet the employee's request, then go ahead and ask if it's related to a major life event. And then if you are not able to meet that request, then go ahead and put that denial in writing. And of course, there has to be a bona fide business reason for not being able to meet that request. So here in front of you, you see the list of the bona fide business reasons. It is significant and identifiable cost. So that's not speculative, it's a tangible cost, and significant is in there because it does need to be high. When this part of the law was being developed, there was a corollary to reasonable accommodation process under the Americans with Disabilities Act and our state and local discrimination laws that sets quite a high bar and hurdle as far as determining what constitutes a significant and identifiable burden of cost. And so that is the same underlying premise for this ordinance as well. Another reason to deny the schedule request would be a disruption of running the business. And that could be causing an employer to violate a seniority system for scheduling folks. It could be causing an employer to displace an employee who already has that set schedule. So certainly don't want to create schedule upheaval for others. It could be that this person who wants to take the class just needs to wait until an availability spot opens. As far as cost, and one example of cost that was written into our administrative rules could be that giving the employee that particular schedule might require premium pay, whether it be premium pay under this law or overtime or holiday pay, those kind of situations. So as a review, for the schedule request, it's for the times and locations of work. That could be a few different locations: West Seattle, North Seattle, Central District. Could be times. That could be, I've got the morning shift, now I want to work the evening shift, etc. Make sure to interact with the employee, discuss the request, give them an answer within 3 weeks. You are able to ask for verifying information if it is related to a major life event. That could be as simple as a written statement from them. There are other examples, such as a school roster or a pay stub from another job or a bus schedule or something of that nature. But at its simplest, the employee is able to simply provide a written statement. If an employer suspects abuse of that, then they could go ahead and ask for an additional form of acceptable documentation. But that would only be appropriate in situations where the employer believes that there is a clear instance or pattern of abuse of this schedule request. So those are the major points of the right to request section. And next we are going to discuss the right to rest. This section is in regards to a familiar word to us all now. Maybe it wasn't familiar 5 years ago, but I think most of us now know what a clopening is. It is a closing and opening shift that happen consecutively. This law now requires that employees have an adequate amount of time to go home and rest during those clopenings, to recharge and to spend time with family, and that period of time is 10 hours. So employers are not allowed to schedule employees for clopenings that are separated by less than 10 hours unless the employee specifically requests it or consents to it. So when you're hiring someone, as part of the whole onboarding process, managers certainly could ask, are you comfortable with working a clopening separated by less than 10 hours? And that could be ongoing consent. But if not, then those types of shifts will not even be scheduled for the employee. Now, if the employee is scheduled for a clopening separated by less than 10 hours, then there will always be a premium pay requirement. And this premium pay requirement applies even if the employee wants it. So if the employee is liking those tightly scheduled shifts because it allows them to make their childcare work or it allows them to work a second job, they still can get it, but the employer will always have to pay this premium pay. And in this respect, this clopening regulation is kind of like overtime. It's all about health and safety. Employees certainly might want to work more than 40 hours, but if they do, then they'll get time and a half. For the right to rest pay, employees will receive time and a half, the scheduled rate of pay, for hours worked that are less than 10 hours apart. An example of that is if the employee closes at midnight and then opens again at 8, instead of 10 hours separating those shifts, there are now 8. So the employee will get 1.5 times pay for 2 hours. So if the employee is typically paid $20 an hour, for those 2 hours between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., they'll be receiving $30 an hour. Exceptions to this rule is that it does not apply to a split shift, which is defined in our administrative rules, and that is the shift basically where it's a very long shift that is separated by a rest break that is longer than an hour but not more than 4 hours. As far as double shifts go, the right to rest pay will not apply to double shifts that are in the same workday, but if they're spanning 2 work days or 2 calendar days, then the right to rest pay will apply. Next, we have what is arguably the simplest part of the law to understand. It is advance notice of work schedule, and employers must provide a work schedule 14 days in advance. The law does not require how long that work schedule needs to be. It could be a week, it could be 3 days, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks, but it must be provided 14 days in advance. So now that July 1st has passed, the first schedule in which businesses are able to provide 14 days advance notice is when they need to start doing that. So I guess that's best explained with an example. If the current schedule that's out didn't have to follow the 2-week advance notice schedule, depending on when that was initially posted. But say the next schedule begins on July 17, then the employer would have needed to have provided notice on July 3rd. Let's see, we're already at July 7. So if there's a schedule being posted today, that schedule would probably start on July 21st, and so on and so on. The advance notice of work schedule is one of the documents that does need to be translated, and so we are working on a template for that. Given that much of schedules is numbers based, there probably won't be too much translation required, but we are going and working diligently on getting a template for that for workers and for employers. Now, as with many of our different parts of the law, there are exceptions. And the exception for this advance notice is for new and returning employees. So for new employees, and businesses don't have to wait 3 weeks before putting them on the schedule. They can go ahead and give them their entire schedule in one fell swoop by placing them into openings in the current schedule. And they can do this at the time of hire. New employees can be new folks that are just hired. They can also include transfers, promotions, folks with a new job classification. For employees who were jointly employed, say those who were employed by a staffing agency, or maybe it's a maintenance worker who is employed by a subcontractor, those folks are considered new every time they start an assignment. And this exception also includes returning employees from a leave of absence. So we've heard from some businesses that since they have such a high turnover rate, that what they foresee doing is placing some, as they call them, ghost shifts or open shifts on their schedule. And then as they hire new people, they will go ahead and just plug them into those open shifts. The only thing to remember is that if new folks aren't hired and you need to put current employees into those shifts, that they will be owed premium pay. And that is something that we will discuss next. Doesn't look like we have any questions about this section. So when there is a schedule change after this advance notice of the work schedule, employers are required to provide additional pay for changes that the employer initiates. There are some exceptions, but first we'll go over the basic requirements for the additional pay. Now, this additional pay is, of course, in addition to payment for all the hours that the employee is working. If the business adds hours, then employees are due payment for 1 hour at the scheduled rate. If the added time is less than an hour, then employers can go ahead and prorate it. And there is a grace period of 15 minutes for both additions and subtractions. So for additions, if someone is scheduled for a shift that is 10 a.m. until 4 p.m., if the manager asks the employee to stay until 4:30, that is 30 minutes of additional time. The employee would receive pay for working those 30 minutes and then an additional premium pay for 30 minutes. If the employee is asked to work from 10 until 5, that is an additional hour of pay. So they'll receive pay for working the hour and then an additional hour of premium pay. The third example is that if the employee is asked to stay from 10 until 6, that is 2 hours of additional time, but there is a cap on what the premium pay is for adding time, and it is set at an hour. So the employee would only receive 1 hour of premium pay, even though they're working 2 additional hours. For subtracting hours, employees must be paid for half the hours not worked, and that is applied to regular shifts and to on-call shifts. So if someone is on call for the 10 to 4 shift and they're not called in, they will receive pay for 3 hours because the shift was scheduled for 6 hours, they weren't called in, 3 hours is half of that. If an employee is working 10 until 4, but they're asked to go home 2 hours early, then they'll get paid for an hour, an extra hour. That is half the length of the remaining part of the shift. Again, the grace period does apply. So if someone is sent home 15 minutes early, no premium pay is due. If someone stays 15 minutes late, no premium pay is due. For businesses that use a rounding system for their time clock, that 15 minutes could be longer or shorter depending on when the employee clocks out. So if the time clock automatically kicks to 15 minutes at 8 minutes past the hour, well, then the grace period is going to be a little bit shorter for those employees. Conversely, it might go to 15 minutes when it's 16 minutes past the hour. So that'll depend on the employer's unique rounding practice. I've got a question at long last. Thank you, Mindy. Can a company subtract the 15-minute grace period from the premium pay if the additional time is less than an hour? So thank you for asking that. Once the premium pay is due, then it is due for the entire amount of time with no subtraction for the grace period. So in the example of an employee staying 30 minutes late, they were scheduled to end their shift at 4 and they're staying until 4:30. The premium pay for those 30 minutes will be for 30 minutes. So there is no subtraction of 15 minutes because of the grace period. What the grace period does is just delay when the premium pay starts, or when it's due. Maybe is due is better than starts. So Tracy asked, just making sure I hear this correctly, if I ask someone to work an additional 5 hours, only one of those hours is paid at the premium of 1.5. So to be clear, I think it's easier to think of the 1.5 as just due for the right to rest pay for those hours that are separated by less than 10 hours between the closing and opening shift. For the premium pay for scheduled changes, it will be a max of 1 hour of additional pay for adding any time. So if someone is scheduled to work, or someone is asked to work 5 additional hours, say they are scheduled to work a really short shift, they're asked to work 5 additional hours, they only have the legal right to 1 hour of premium pay. So Amanda asked, does the premium pay impact calculation of overtime pay? So what we know definitively is that premium pay doesn't count as hours worked. So the payment of that premium pay will not increase the employee's hours towards meeting that 40-hour threshold before overtime is due. What we are still researching is whether the premium pay needs to be considered part of the regular rate for determining the base rate for calculating overtime, what is time and a half. So we've received a number of very strong opinions on this, and we are hopeful that we'll be able to provide a definitive answer in the future. We're not quite there yet. I think what we've heard most recently is that in some instances, the premium pay will not be considered part of the regular rate, depending on whether it's adding hours, but in some instances, it might actually be considered part of the regular rate. These are things that are, to our knowledge, out of our control, and they will be determined by state and federal law regarding when overtime is due. So Labor and Industries certainly has some helpful guidance on that, and we definitely want to make sure that employers are supported in knowing what is owed to their workers as far as the regular rate. So we're working on that as well. Savannah asked, how does premium pay stack with overtime? So I think I answered that question, but if Savannah, if you have a more precise question, feel free to type it in. So those are the basics of when premium pay is due. And then think of it this way, almost every time that an employer is having a one-on-one conversation with workers, whether it's by phone or by text or by email or in person, this premium pay is going to be due, regardless of the reason that there is a need for that time in the schedule. That said, there are some exceptions, and we'll go into those next. So these exceptions apply, and when these exceptions apply, employers are not required to pay the premium pay. So first we have employee requested changes. So if an employee says, hey, I'm scheduled for Saturday, but that time doesn't work for me, I actually have a concert that I want to go to. If you as a manager, or if the manager grants that request, then that employee doesn't need premium pay for the lost hours because that happened as a result of their particular request. Similarly, if an employee is waiting on a table as a server and is scheduled to leave at 10, but the customers are still there, and the server wants to close out the table to get the full tip and works an extra hour or an extra 45 minutes, if that extra time is due to the employee's request, no premium pay is due. That is due to their request to stay late. If an employee is swapping shifts with another worker, say they want to go to the concert, as the manager said, sure, you can go, but find your own coverage. So if that's the case, the employee who is no longer working the Saturday shift to go to the concert, that person doesn't get premium pay because that's an employee request. And the person who is filling in doesn't get premium pay either because that is considered an employee request. For this shift swapping, of course, that is subject to manager approval. So managers can say yes or no, depending on their discretion. Perhaps the saying yes could lead to overtime for the substitute employee, or perhaps there is a belief that the substitute employee is not qualified. So managers are not required to say yes to all of these shift swaps, but if they do, then no premium pay is owed. If an employee accepts a new job or new job classification as a result of a job posting, those new hours on the schedule, or the lost hours if they're moving into a new position, are not going to trigger this premium pay requirement. If an employee has reduced hours due to discipline, again, that's not going to trigger the premium pay requirement. If the place of business cannot begin or continue operations due to very specific reasons that are listed in our rules and in our ordinance, then premium pay is not due. So, for example, if the business is shutting its doors and closing shop because the heater is broken, or there is no water, or the power went out, that's an example of a public utilities failure that would not require premium pay. If there is a natural disaster and the business is shutting down, no premium pay. If there is inclement weather, such as the windstorm or the snowstorm, and the business is shutting down, again, no premium pay. This exception really is for the extreme examples of the business is no longer operating. It's not appropriate for when the business is just slimming down to a skeletal staff because of knowledge that business will decrease. This is for when the business is actually no longer going to operate. That said, if there is a decision to close the business, and maybe there are 10 employees working, 7 are initially let go, 3 are staying there just to shut down the business, no premium pay is due for all of those folks if the 3 that are remaining are purely working to shut down the business and then it shuts early and everyone goes home. Now, the next 2 exceptions require a little bit more explanation, so I'll get to those in a moment. I want to answer some basic questions from Tim and Amanda. Will premium pay apply for employees who are not asked to work long than scheduled, but do because they want overtime? So if an employee is not asked but volunteers, hey, I noticed that we're busy, I'd really like to stay late, that is an example of an employee request and no premium pay is due. But again, this request originated from the employee, and that is what is important about it, and that is why it doesn't trigger the premium pay. The premise of this law is that there is more interaction between managers and employees during setting the schedule, and so that's why the right to request section exists. But when it comes to schedule changes, the law is working towards less interaction between managers and employees, knowing that even if a manager is asking for someone to cover a shift and it's made known that it's purely voluntary, it can still be hard due to a power dynamic for folks to say, no, I'm not able to do that. And it causes a disruption in employees' schedule when they do say yes, and particularly for folks who are trying to juggle the class or the daycare or the care of a family member or the other job, saying yes can be quite disruptive. So that's why the premium pay is due in those situations. If employers have a standing policy that employees can always ask whether or not to leave early or to stay late, then that might be an idea that you're interested in. Just make sure that if you have that kind of policy, that it's not being abused where you are reminding folks of it during a particularly slow or busy moment. That just would need to be a standing policy. Tell them about it when they're hired, put it in their manual, remind them about it at a staff meeting. So Amanda asked, to confirm, what if employer asked employees who would be willing to accept the schedule change on a completely voluntary basis? Would we still be required to pay the premium pay? So I'm so glad that you asked that. It doesn't matter if the employee is accepting the schedule change on a voluntary basis. If the employee is being asked to stay late or to leave early by the manager, by the owner, by the employer, then the premium pay is due unless any of these very specific exceptions apply. So when in doubt, the premium pay applies, even if the employee wants those hours. It's just like with the tightly scheduled clopening. Even if the employee wants those hours, that premium pay is due. It's just like with overtime. Even if folks want to work over 40 hours, that time and a half is due. For premium pay for schedule changes, it's due unless one of these very narrow exceptions apply. So for mass communication, this is only available as an exception when a scheduled employee is unable to work. So the classic example is Maria is scheduled to work on Friday, but she called out sick, whether it be a week in advance or the morning of. The business is able to send a mass communication to 2 or more employees about the availability of these hours. And if someone accepts, then that would not trigger the premium pay requirement. Now, this mass communication can only be used for additional hours, only when a scheduled employee can't work, and it has to have some basic information in it. It has to be identified as a mass communication. It has to make clear that accepting the hours is voluntary, they have the right to decline, and then 3, that accepting such hours does not trigger the premium pay requirement. So that's helpful both for them to set their expectations appropriately and to make sure that you don't have low morale when you don't pay them the premium pay because it's not due. Also helps our office because we don't have folks contacting us for situations when they're not even actually owed the premium pay. Now, this mass communication can be a text, it can be an email, it can be a posting on the bulletin board. It does need to be identified as a mass communication. It does need to have all these 1, 2, 3 pieces to it. As you might imagine, if you're receiving a text, you don't always know if it's being sent just to yourself or to a whole group of folks. Same thing with an email. If everyone is blind copied, you don't know if it's just sent to you or to a whole bunch of folks. So it is important to identify it as a mass communication. If you're putting up this information on the bulletin board wall, again, really important to have all these pieces in it because you might also have bulletin board postings for open shifts that aren't going to be subject to an exception. And so for this particular situation, folks need to know that they don't have the right to the premium pay. The next exception is called an in-person group communication. This is for situations where folks are currently working, there is an unanticipated customer need for unscheduled hours, and the employer is huddling a group of workers asking them if they can stay longer. So again, this is only for additional hours. It's the sunny day where business is booming unexpectedly. It is the game day where you have more foot traffic in your business. It's the holiday season where folks are buying lots of gifts. It's the beginning of the school year. School supplies are flying out the door. If the employer huddles a group of 2 or more employees, both of those employees are able to have their shift end before these new hours begin, and these new hours are consecutive to their current scheduled shift. And if they say yes, then no premium pay is due. So if you were to gather Sarah and Arlene, they're both cashiers, they both are scheduled to work 10 until 2. You want to ask if one of them can work until 4. That would be an example of an in-person group communication. And again, it does have this required information, or 2 pieces of the required information that we just talked about with mass communication. Accepting the offer of additional hours is voluntary, and the employee has the right to decline. And again, this premium pay requirement is not triggered. Amanda asked, are there record retention requirements for the mass communication? So again, thanks so much for asking that. There are a number of record-keeping requirements with this law. And so basically anything that is required to be written is going to be subject to the records retention requirement for 3 years. Keep track of those records, and also a number of other things as well, including employee request for schedule changes. Now, having said that, technology has a great variety of ways for keeping this information. So for an employee request, it could be as simple as a checkbox in your scheduling software application, or a checkbox in your drop-down menu of your Excel spreadsheet. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an employee writing out, I would like to not work on Saturday, and then signing their name. It can take a wide variety of forms for that sort of written record-keeping requirement. Toward the end of the presentation, there is a long list of all of the different things that need to be kept as far as records. For written mass communication, that is another example of a record. The written good faith estimate, another example of a written record. Now, this next section is called Access to Hours. This addresses the issue of what is known as involuntary part-time work. So research shows that there are a number of folks who are working part-time and would like to increase their hours, but are finding it difficult because some businesses are hiring more and more and more people with wider ranges of availability rather than concentrating the number of hours with their existing workforce. Now, as with this entire law, it's creating a level playing field. So certainly it is recognized that there are already many employers who are already looking within before hiring external employees, or already employers who are already accommodating their employees' schedule preferences or already providing 14 days advance notice of schedule. What this law does is create a level playing field among all employers so that there is a foundational starting place for these predictable schedules, and there's a level of accountability as well. So for this piece, the premise is that before hiring new employees, and that does include hiring temporary employees, whether by direct hire or through a staffing agency, employers must offer those hours of work to current employees before hiring new folks. The way it works is that employers will be posting notice of the additional hours for 3 days. There is a translation requirement for this, and that information must be posted in a noticeable place for all employees on the payroll. During these 3 days of notice, the business certainly can post external notice as well. So it could be that you are posting this internal notice on the bulletin board, you're also posting it on Craigslist or wherever you post those job notices, and at the end of those 3 days, if a current employee who is qualified expresses interest, the employer is required to go ahead and hire them and to give them 2 days to consider the job offer. If at the end of those 2 days, the employee is not interested, then the employer can hire external folks. So there are 2 ways of thinking how this impacts hiring practices. It could be as little as 3 days if the notice is posted and no employee voiced interest. If an employee does voice interest, then the maximum amount it's going to impact the hiring practice is going to be 5 days. 3 days of notice, 2 days for the job offer. If more than one person express interest in the job, then it is up to the employer to decide who to hire, and that can be based on the employer's requirements, whether it be on skills, seniority, etc. Now, when parceling out the hours, employers are not allowed to bundle all of the hours and require all of them to be accepted. So for example, if someone quits and there's suddenly 24 hours at play, the employer cannot require that all 24 hours be taken. However, the employer can distinguish them by shifts. So it could be that 24 hours equals 3 8-hour shifts. So the business could require an employee to take 1 shift or 2 shifts rather than all the 24. If the current employee takes 2 shifts and then there's the dangling shift that's left over, then that could perhaps be distributed among existing staff, or that could lead to someone being hired for just 1 shift. Now, also keep in mind that if a business would like to just simply redistribute hours among the existing workforce, then access to hours doesn't even apply. That can just be handled through maybe premium pay for those hours for the posted schedule, and then after that, then just continue on. If you do hire an existing employee through this access to hours because the hours have been posted, then actually premium pay wouldn't apply because it's one of those exceptions for a new employee being added to the schedule. Now, as with many of the other parts of the law that we've discussed, there are exceptions to this access to hours requirement that can speed up the hiring process. The first one is that during that 3 days of notice period, the employer can receive a written declination from all current employees that they are not interested in those additional hours, and then can immediately hire. So this is going to work best for the very small businesses. Say it's a franchise that maybe only has 5 employees locally. If those new hours are posted and then the manager gets signatures from all 5 employees, or the checkbox, or whatever the method is, again, keep track of this for 3 years, then the employer can immediately begin to hire. Maybe they're able to hire on the 2nd day rather than on the 4th. Another option is to create access to hours list of different types of jobs that might become available. They can be distinguished by job classification or by the type of shift, like the Saturday shift, if everyone is considered the same job classification. And when someone is hired, they're automatically on all the different kinds of access to hours lists. So it could be for a restaurant that someone is automatically on the access to hours list for the host and the server and the busser and the bartender and the cook and the dishwasher and the expediter. But if they are not interested in being on all those lists and always receiving notice of those additional hours, they can let the business know, hey, I'm only interested in server jobs, so just keep me on that list. And so what you see might be able to happen is that these lists naturally become smaller and smaller and smaller, so that when you need to get written declination from everybody on that list, maybe you're only asking for 5 written forms of declination rather than 25 or 100. So those are options that can be used to quicken the hiring process if employers are not interested in waiting on the 3-day or the 5-day delay. There is one last exception for diversity hiring programs, and this could be for situations when the business wants to hire a certain number of young adult workers, or a certain number of senior workers, or a certain number of supported employment workers. The business is able to hire a certain percentage of those kinds of employees and not have to follow the access to hours requirements. There are a number of requirements for this, which we won't go into detail here. The program does need to be approved by our Labor Standards Advisory Commission, and the business also would need to submit a notice to our office that would need to be approved and confirmed by us. So Savannah has a question. Does this mean we have to offer full-time status to associates who were hired at part-time status if they want to take on additional hours? So what this means is that the access to hours provision does apply to all part-time workers. And so if there is a way that they will get to full-time, then yes, then the employer would need to do that, even if they were hired on a part-time basis. And so full-time is defined as 40 hours. So if the employer has a policy of, or used to have a policy of not hiring people for more than 30 hours a week, that type of policy would no longer be valid, and all folks would need to be given the opportunity to move up to 40 hours. And Savannah, if you have more questions, please feel free to write and I'll get to them. So other requirements of the law: record keeping, there's a workplace poster, protections against retaliation waiver, and then a quick comment about employees who are jointly employed. So for the record keeping, you see quite a long list here. Seemed helpful to get it all on one slide, but these are all of the things that employers are required to keep a written record of for 3 years. Now again, written record can mean the piece of paper kept in the file. It also can mean something that is kept electronically. And in certain situations, that can even mean a checkbox, say if it's an employer checking a box where this was an employee request. We do have a secure scheduling workplace poster requirement, and this poster was just released by our office last week. You can find it on our website. We are currently in the process of having professionally printed versions of this as well, which you can pick up at our office. We'll also have them available at the City of Seattle customer service centers. We'll also be on foot delivering some of them, likely not to all 1,100 covered businesses, but we'll try to get to some. Bit of friendly outreach, and it can be downloaded from our website. This does have a translation requirement, so we are working on the translations. Again, join our newsletter list for personal notice of when those translations are available, and regularly check our website. We have added something at the bottom of this poster, which is new, and that allows employees to check a circle to indicate what translations they would like. So if you already know what translations are necessary for your workforce, then go ahead and just put them up. This checkbox, or check circle as it actually is, allows employees in an anonymous way, if they so choose, to indicate that they would like this information in another language. We have, I think, 11 or 12 languages at the bottom of the poster now that we are planning on making translations for. If there is a language that is not included in that list, just contact our office and we will make it happen. This is our general workplace poster that is probably already up in your office. If it's not, again, you can download it. You can get it from our office. It is a requirement. This is the workplace poster for our other laws: minimum wage, wage theft, fair chance employment, and paid sick and safe time. This is the full list of items that need to be translated. Again, we're making templates for those translations. It's a good faith estimate, advance notice of work schedule, the notice for access to hours, and our poster. Retaliation, as with all of our labor standards laws, if an employee has a good faith assertion of their rights under this law, which can take many different forms. It can be as simple as making a schedule request, asking, do I get premium pay? Where is my premium pay? Participating in an investigation. The employer is not allowed to retaliate against them, whether it be reducing hours or intimidating or anything that might have a chilling effect on the employee expressing their rights under the law. I also have highlighted in red that employees have the right to decline any hours that are not on the posted schedule. So that means that employers certainly are able to ask, can you stay an extra half hour late? But the employee has the right to say, no, actually, I'm not able to do that for whatever reason it might be. It might be the need to scramble home to relieve a child care provider. It could be to get to the class, or it could be to get to a social engagement, and they have the right to say no. However, employers certainly can reduce hours from the employee's schedule, and they have the right, employers have the right to do that. Premium pay will be due, but the employers do have the right to do that. Discipline is permitted for certain situations. Just definitely want to emphasize that this law does not excuse employees from meeting job expectations and job requirements. So if there's an abuse of the employer's requirements for employee requested work schedule changes or preferences prior to the posted schedule or after the posted schedule, then employers certainly are able to impose their reasonable disciplinary measures for those situations. Waiver is allowed, but only for employees who are represented by a union. This absolutely does not apply to individual employees, and the waiver must be expressly in the collective bargaining agreement or in a memorandum of understanding or memorandum of agreement to the collective bargaining agreement, and employees need to ratify an alternative scheduling structure that meets the policy goals of this law. Quick comment about employees who are jointly employed. This applies to folks who are hired by a staffing agency or who are hired by a contractor or subcontractor. So it could be business is booming in December. A business hires some temps through a staffing agency. There is an actual joint employment relationship with those folks. Or the business has security or maintenance provided by a contractor or a subcontractor, and there's a joint employment relationship. Then for those kind of situations, this law will apply. There is joint liability, and this slide provides examples of how to deal with each situation for each requirement in the law. The beginning of each assignment is considered a new employment. So if an employee is filling in for a day, that's a new assignment. Provide them with the good faith estimate, provide them with the advance notice of work schedule. You don't need to worry about payment. Well, I guess if you extend the shift, you do need to actually pay for the work schedule change, but otherwise, no. If you are beginning a security guard who has a 6-week assignment, then for that first schedule, they're a new employee, but for thereafter, they are not. And so all of the law applies without any exception. Quick comment about enforcement, and then we will be open for more question and answers. We do have a soft launch of enforcement lasting from the effective date, which was, of course, July 1st, for 6 months through the end of December. During this period of time, our office will be determining the remedy owed to employees, and we'll be supporting employer compliance, but we will not be imposing penalties or fines except for egregious violations, and an example of that would be retaliation. So we really want businesses to feel supported as much as we can help with that during the early days and the ongoing days of this law as well. And so that's what the soft launch is about. There is a private right of action connected to this law, which means that employees can file a lawsuit. The remedy is up to 3 times the amount owed, up to $5,000 to the aggrieved party for retaliation, and the ability to recover attorney fees and cost. For our administrative investigations, those remedies are the same. I guess the city can obtain attorney fees and cost. Our investigations are often company-wide. The exception would be for allegations of retaliation. We absolutely protect the identifying information of folks that contact our office, whether to report a violation or whether to be a witness in our investigation. So we're protecting that identifying information before, during, and after the investigative process. We are both complaint-based and are beginning a directed investigation program where instead of launching investigations from a complaint, it is based on tips or information from other jurisdiction on national employers that have violated labor standards but who are operating in Seattle. Also could be data analysis. Please know that for secure scheduling, we will be only conducting complaint-based investigations for quite some time. And we are transparent about launching this directed investigation program, so you'll be hearing more about that in the course of this summer to know what to expect from that. We're not announcing which is a directed investigation and which is a complaint-based, of course, but do want to keep the public informed of when these new types of investigative processes are happening. This is a slide that shows the remedy and penalties that are connected with this law. As you can see, they are high. For the first violation, it can be up to 3 times the amount owed plus interest. For subsequent violations, it's a mandatory 3 times the amount that is owed. The penalties are tiered depending on whether it is a first, second, or third violation. It is our hope that folks will never get to the second or third violation. And we do have monitored compliance, which creates some work for the business, but it also helps businesses stay on track. And for any of our penalties, they are at the director's discretion. And so our director is taking into account all of the circumstances that led to the violation and determining whether or not the penalties are appropriate. And penalties also might be able to be waived depending on speedy payment of the amount due to workers. Just to note that most of our investigations do close by settlement, which certainly allows the voice of the business in the closure process. And central to all of our investigations is making sure that the worker receives the amount that is owed. So our last slide is a resounding thank you for spending your time this morning to learn more about this very important law. We are so glad that you joined us. We hope that you'll join our newsletter list and stay on board for more developments. And we have a period of time to answer questions and answers. So if folks would like to dive in, I'm certainly eager to answer. Feel free to type in a question. We don't have that many folks listening. There's about 26 of us right now, so you also can ask a question with your mic as well.
Karina, can we go back to the access to hours real quick?
Absolutely.
So let's say that we have a retail establishment and they maybe only have 10 associates in that one location. And for whatever reason, 3 of them quit in a week with no notice. can we replace those people, or we have to give those hours to existing associates first and then replace? Because it seems like eventually we would dwindle down to only 4 people working 40 hours a week if we don't have that flexibility.
Well, in that situation, certainly depending on the availability of the remaining workforce, the hours that are available due to the folks quitting, those can be reassigned and redistributed to the current employees, if they say yes. And it sounds like, let's say, if you did a mass communication for those hours that people were already scheduled and then quit, and if folks said yes, then no premium pay would be due. But say if you're contacting the existing workforce directly to fill in to those shifts, then the premium pay would be due. If only one person is left, then there's only one option to contact that person. So premium pay would be due. As far as scrambling to get folks hired, then the access to hours requirements will apply, but it seems like with that small of a workforce that it's going to be relatively quick to get that written declination if folks aren't interested, and then you can hire externally. If the folks are interested, then if they want the hours and if they're qualified, then go ahead and give them to them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
It pertains to the commission-based employees who are under the Washington State or that retail services exemption. Will this apply to them?
So are you talking about sales folks that are considered overtime exempt or overtime eligible?
They're overtime exempt as long as they make 1.5 times minimum wage for all hours worked. But you won't know that until the end of the pay period.
Well, that's an excellent question that I don't think we've thought about yet. So, I mean, typically we would say if they're overtime exempt, then they're not covered. But what I'm hearing you say is that you won't know if they're overtime exempt until the end of the pay period. So it could be that you're keeping track of all of their schedule changes. And then at the end of the pay period, if they're not overtime exempt, then you're going ahead and paying them the premium pay. If they are overtime exempt, then you don't. So it seems like it will be a pay period by pay period decision, just like it already is a pay period by pay period decision whether or not they're overtime exempt.
Yes. So this would apply to them if they're not overtime exempt, if they don't meet the overtime
Correct.
exemption?
Correct.
Okay.
I also had a question about the templates that are available. So I found the good faith estimate, but are there any other templates available for like the access to hours list or the declination letter form or anything, or was it just the good faith estimate?
So right now what we have available is the good faith estimate, but we are creating templates for the things that we have to provide templates for, which is advance notice of work schedule, the access to hours, and I believe those are the ones we have to provide a template for. And then we're also making a wish list of things that we want to make templates for. And so what I'm hearing you say is that it would be helpful to have a template for the written declination. And so I'll add that to our list. We also are going to create a model waiver form for folks who are represented by a union. We have a model waiver form for our paid sick and safe time ordinance as well. So that's another template that we will create. If you have other ideas for things that would be helpful as a template, let us know and we'll endeavor to make that happen. And any other questions?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Can you just clarify one more time what is considered overtime? I mean, full-time as opposed to part-time? Because our corporation is anyone who works 30 hours plus is considered full-time.
So
now, you said that it's now 40 hours. So is that going to change now for us?
So it sounds like it's going to change for you. So we're using 40 hours per work week as the benchmark, tying it into overtime. If anyone works, or to that overtime regulation as a benchmark. And so if anyone works less than 40 hours, then the access to hours provision is going to apply. And folks have the ability to get up to those 40 hours, even if your company has defined full-time differently up until now.
Okay, so even if they worked, let's say, on the average of like 28, 29 hours, and all of a sudden they're on the average of 36, 37 hours, that's still considered part-time?
If it's less than 40 hours, it'll be considered part-time. Now,
okay.
That said, what we need to do in our administrative rules is devise a way for employers to figure out what is considered full-time, especially for folks whose schedules are changing, sometimes due to their own request. And so I imagine that we'll come up with some sort of look-back period formula for employers to figure that out. So if you have any ideas, then we certainly welcome your input. I haven't studied it extensively, but I'm thinking like there's a look-back period for the Affordable Care Act. So that could be an example of a type of formula to determine what is 40 hours a week. All right, any other questions? If not, we can wrap up. All right, well, we will call it a wrap. We ended up a little bit early. Thanks so much again to everyone who participated this morning. If questions arise later on, of course, do not hesitate to contact us by email and by phone. We have a high volume of questions, but we've got more than one of us answering, and so we're working really diligently to answer everyone. Appreciate your patience if it does take longer than 2 days, and stay tuned for more training opportunities and more templates and newsletters and so on. So thanks so much. Enjoy the sun and have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.